Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming. Before I start, I'd like to know a little bit more about you. And so I wonder if we could do a little bit of a sort of an introduction session. Could you do this? Could you talk to the person who's next to you? And if you're on your own, move over and find someone to be next to you. And then find out a few things about them, and in particular, why they decided to come to this seminar. Well, thank you everybody for those introductions. I know a little bit more about you now. So this is Wales. It's a small country next to England, and this is where I grew up. I grew up on a little island, and these are the mountains, and this is the sea, and it's really beautiful. And if you get a chance, you must go there. I think it's paradise. The really nice thing is, at the time that I went to university, the government paid for children to go to university. So nearly all of my education has been paid for by the public. And so I'm really lucky, aren't I? I'm really, really lucky. So given that nearly all of my education has been paid for by the public, I've got a responsibility to the public. That's the way I see it. And so what is my responsibility? Now, I became a doctor and then I became a researcher. I believe my obligation to the public is to tell the truth. I think that's the most important thing that the public would expect from researchers. You see, researchers are really lucky. Now, there's a book I read when I was a kid. America had invaded Vietnam, and when I was a child, I used to watch the TV, and there was all these bombs falling on Vietnam all the time, and I used to wonder what the heck's going on? You know, why is this happening? And it was very difficult to tell from watching the news or reading the papers. According to the news, somehow Vietnam was invading America. I couldn't figure it out, but it seemed to be that it looked like American bombers were dropping bombs on Vietnam, and I thought, well, what's going on here? And it was very difficult to find out. And then I read a book by Noam Chomsky, and I really liked it. I read things by Noam Chomsky, and he seemed to tell the story very clearly. And I got interested in the sorts of things that he wrote, and he wrote something that really made sense to me. He said, the responsibility of intellectuals is anybody, I think, who's had a good education. The responsibility of people who've had a good education is to tell the truth and to expose lies. Yeah? So you have had a good education. It doesn't matter if the public paid for it or not. In a way, the public always pays somehow. But you've had a good education, and so your responsibility too is to tell the truth and expose lies, I believe. It's our main job. And if you know that, it becomes very easy when you describe yourself. You know, what do you do? I'm a whatever you are, and my job is to tell the truth and expose lies. And that sums up, I think, the main responsibility of a researcher. And it's because, it's another paragraph, Chomsky writes, for a privileged minority, and we're all privileged, Western democracy or Eastern democracy or whatever, provides the leisure, the facilities, and the training to seek the truth lying hidden behind the veil of distortion and misrepresentation. So we're given this luxury, this real luxury of having time and resources like the libraries and the papers and the computers and everything to actually try and find the truth. Yeah. So we've got I think that it's the reason research integrity matters. It's part of our job description. You know, it's the most important part of our job description. And it's a funny thing, really, because it's so important, but nobody ever teaches you about it. I don't know if you've noticed that. There are certain things that people can't talk about. It used to be sex, but now people can talk about sex. They find death difficult to talk about. But in universities, we can talk about sex and death, but we can't talk about research integrity. Research integrity seems to be the thing that nobody can talk about. So I work in a London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I don't think we get students from all over the world. We teach them epidemiology, statistics, infectious diseases, everything, but we don't teach them research integrity. And it struck me how strange is that actually we're a school of public health and we don't teach research integrity. We don't even talk about it, actually. I thought that was strange, and so I putting this sort of course together was something that interested me. Although it is getting noticed as an issue by the public. The public thinks research integrity is very important. People in universities don't think so because they don't seem to talk about it at all. But the public thinks it's important. And we've got in the UK, we've got a sort of government inquiry into research integrity in the UK. And I think that's a really good thing. Now, I was trying to find out about what research integrity means, how you say that in Japanese, and it's kosei. Kenkyu kosei. Why are you laughing? My Japanese is so bad. Kenkyu kosei. Integrity is a funny. Integrity in the English word. It has a sort of two senses. It has something that's integral is kind of whole. So it's the kind of opposite of being divided up into pieces. When you're whole, that's a sense of integrity, but it also has the meaning of being honest and having strong moral principles. And there's a kind of, in a kind of Zen way, there's a bit of a link between those two, I think. You get a feel of, if you're dishonest, you're not kind of whole, you're all pulled in different in directions. So there are a number of definitions of research integrity, and they're a bit difficult. Possessing and adhering to high moral principles and professional standards. So the difficulty of this is that there's high moral principles and professional standards. So you've got this problem. You've got this. You can divide responsible conduct of research into two kind of areas, really. There's research ethics, and that's what those are kind of moral discussions about what you should do. Is it right to, moral questions about right and wrong. And then there's research integrity. I think research integrity is more a sense of, are you adhering to the appropriate professional standards in your work? And I just want to focus on this one to some extent. I think moral principles, you can have all sorts of moral discussions where it's, is it right to, help somebody end their life, and all of these questions of moral principles. But research integrity is a little bit more straightforward. It's about what's appropriate, what's appropriate given your professional standards. And whereas this one kind of research ethics leads to a lot of questions, research integrity really should lead to a lot of clear guidelines about how you should behave as a researcher. And so we've got this sort of, on the one hand, we've got responsible conduct of research. This is the good news. And it's conducting research in ways that fulfill the professional responsibilities as researchers, as defined by their professional organizations, and so forth. And at the other end, we've got research misconduct. Yeah? So we've got responsible conduct of research. That means conducting research according to the kind of guidelines, what would be expected by the public or the institution that you work for on this side. And on this side, you've got research misconduct. Yeah? And research misconduct, in the United States, they talk about FFP. So FFP, and it's fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. Yeah? So fabrication is making up data. Yeah? So when you don't collect data from patients, you just actually make it up. I think in Japanese it's netsuzo. Is that right? So fabrication is netsuzo. Falsification is different. Falsification is where there is data, but you change it. Yeah? I can't remember what that is. Is it giso? Anybody? Kaizan. Okay. So we've got netsuzo, kaisan, and plagiarism is when you take other people's work and you pretend it's your own, and you don't acknowledge the fact it's somebody else's work. And I think that's toyo. Is that right? So we've got netsuzo, kaiso. Is that right? Kai, what did you tell me? Kai. Zan or Dan? Zan. Netsuzo, Kaidan, and Kaizan, sorry, and Toyo. There we are. See, you've all been educated in Japanese very badly. So there's a US Office of Research Integrity, and these are the things it's mainly interested in. Yeah. So you've got responsible conduct of research on one end, you've got fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism at the other end. Yeah? And this is good behavior, this is bad behavior. And in the middle we've got this. It's QRP, and that stands for questionable research practices. Yeah? So questionable research practices. So this is responsible conduct of research. This is what we want everybody to do. We don't want fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. And then we've got this grey area in between. And tomorrow we're going to talk about this grey area in between. And the sorts of things that are in the grey area are things that we shouldn't really do, but actually are done quite commonly. So this one, selective reporting based on p-values. For some people, that's just normal epidemiology. That's just routine epidemiology. Let's look at a lot of associations. Wow, that's interesting. Let's publish that one. Yeah? So that one is so common, I think you'd have to say it's almost so common, it's normal practice. Selective reporting of outcome measures, that's very similar. That's like saying, well, there's no significant results of that, so we won't bother publishing that result, or we won't put it in the abstract. Negative results or studies not published, it could be the whole study not published. So sometimes, you get one of the negative results, but you publish the overall results and you just leave that particular result out. Sometimes you actually think, well, the whole thing I'm not going to publish. Nothing going on there. Negative, you know. Sometimes you do lots of subgroup analyses, trying to find something that's interesting. You know, people with, you know, although this treatment's not effective, it seems to be effective in people with one leg and red hair. You know, you get that sort of thing. So inappropriate subgroup analysis, data-dependent stopping or continuing. You know, we look at the results, think, wow, that's a great result, let's stop. You know, let's stop now. Excluding data after looking at the impact of doing so, and claiming to have predicted an unexpected finding. As expected, you know, there was a highly significant. These are known as questionable research practices, but they're actually very common, and tomorrow we'll look at whether they're important or not. Now, there are some important misconceptions. Misconceptions are things that you think are true that are not. One of them is misconduct is rare. Serious misconduct, fabrication, falsification, plagiarism is rare. I'm not sure if that's true. The other one is that questionable research practices are common, they are common, and they're not serious. I think that could be wrong as well. I think they're common and serious. We're going to talk about those tomorrow. And then the final thing is scientists can regulate themselves. You know, that actually we don't need rules, we don't need to be checked because we are moral, upright people and we only ever do the right thing. Yeah, I don't believe that. I don't think it applies to me, I don't think it applies to anybody. So we're going to talk about that. So I got interested in this area because I used to be an emergency physician and I used to work in intensive care, and when I was on call we used to get lots of patients with head injuries. Young men in high-speed car crashes usually. This man, I think he's in Thailand, he's just been hit by a Toyota, he's got a serious head injury, his brain is expanding in his skull. And I'd come across an organization called the Cochrane Collaboration. Has anybody come across the Cochrane Collaboration? Yeah? Anybody? So some of you have heard it. Anybody who hasn't heard about it? Yeah? Okay, the Cochrane Collaboration is an organization that tries to make systematic reviews of the evidence for the effectiveness of different healthcare interventions. It tries to make it easier for doctors. So when a doctor has a patient and they think, well, this particular treatment, is it effective, is it not? Well, you know, rather than getting that doctor to go look for all of the trials, there's an overview of all the trials available, you know, on this in this Cochrane Collaboration, on this Cochrane library, and these systematic reviews. And the Cochrane Collaboration, you know, tries to provide evidence that doctors can trust so that they can make informed decisions for better health. So I got involved in the Cochrane Collaboration, and I started a group that does systematic reviews of evidence for the effectiveness of treatments for injury. Yeah. And one of the treatments I was interested in, because you get a lot of patients, like in this paper I've shown you, that they have a head injury and their brain starts to swell, and if the brain swells too much, it sort of like pushes the brain down into the spinal cord and the patient dies. And that happens quite quickly. And you can give them into the veins this a solution called mannitol, yeah? And it's like sugary water, basically. It's like very sugary, and it pulls water out of the brain by osmosis, yeah? And shrinks the brain a bit. It gives you a bit more time, yeah? So the patient can die very quickly, but if you give them this sugary water, it shrinks the brain down a bit, hopefully give you a bit more time. And I was interested in the evidence from randomized controlled trials about this treatment. And I searched for all of the evidence on this treatment. I don't know, I think I found 3 or 4 randomized controlled trials. And I reviewed it, I did a meta-analysis, and we concluded, and I was the first author of this paper, in patients with acute intracranial hemorrhage, the administration of high-dose mannitol reduces mortality. You know, it's quite dramatic, big reduction, yeah? Relative risk of 1, that means the treatment's not effective. So the relative risk is the risk of death in those who got the treatment divided by the risk of death in those who didn't get the treatment. So if it's 1, there's no effect. If it's less than 1, the treatment's good, yeah? Well, look, 0.55, that's good. That's almost a halving of mortality, yeah? 0.55, and, you know, the p-value is very small. You know, it's a highly statistically significant result. So this seems to be a very good treatment, yeah? I thought so, and I published it in this Cochrane library. And then I was at a, then I met somebody. We were doing a big clinical trial involving lots of doctors from all around the world. I met a doctor from Colombia, and he said to me, Ian, you do know all of those papers that you included in your meta-analyses were fabricated. And I said, what? I didn't know that at all. So the paper that you've all looked at is one of them. So they were 3 papers by the same author, Cruz. Actually, there's a typo here. That should be J. There were Julio Cruz. Julio Cruz, a Brazilian author, wrote 3 studies on the effect of high-dose mannitol in patients with acute severe head injury. And this Colombian said to me, all of these trials are fabricated. And I said, well, you know, how do you know that? You know, how can you be sure? And he said, well, this particular doctor didn't have any head injury patients to do trials on. You know, they just didn't believe they were. So I thought, well, now I have to investigate. I have to find out if these, you know, something more about these trials. So they were all by the same author. They had other authors. Minoja is an Italian, I think, and Okuchi, a Japanese co-author, and Facco is an Italian. So these authors seem to work together and to make these papers, and I thought, well, let's find out more about these. Now, I looked for the address for correspondence. Actually, it might be on this paper. The Comprehensive International Center for Neuroemergencies at the Federal University of Sao Paulo. So there is no Comprehensive International Center for Neurosurgical Emergencies. It's just a PO box in Brazil. You know, it doesn't exist as an entity. I wrote to the Federal University of Sao Paulo about their professor, and they said they never employed him. He's not a professor at this university, they wrote back to me. I wrote to the Brazilian National Ethics Committee. There was no evidence of any ethics approval of any of these studies. And then I wrote to all the co-authors. And the co-authors said, well, we didn't put any patients, no patients from our hospitals were in the trial. We were invited to be a co-author on these papers by Dr. Cruz, Julio Cruz. And in fact, I think on the next slide, yes, these are extracts from the emails they sent to me. You know, so it was a pleasure to be included among the authors of papers written by Dr. Cruz on the use of high-dose mannitol. My unit and I did not provide a personal series of randomized patients, but my contribution was discussing him and sharing his assumption because occasionally, blah, blah, blah. So, you know, he just contributed to the discussion a little bit. This one is one of my favorites. I did not conduct any study related to the results of Dr. Cruz's high-dose mannitol trials in Japan. This is the Japanese author. I have no data to present to you. I did not know any part of the paper before he called me about acceptance in the journal. How interesting. Now, so you get a call and someone says, Callistus, it's good news. You're published. Yeah. And you say, great. You know, you don't say, what do you mean? You say, wow, that's great. What did I do? You know? So, didn't know anything about the paper until it was published, you know? And then, after it was published, didn't complain. Extraordinary, isn't it? And then, so all of the authors were the same. All the authors were, it was almost a gift to them. You know, they didn't contribute very much at all. They were just invited to be co-authors on the paper. Then it gets worse, because I wrote to the journal that published the papers. And I wrote to the editor. And I said to the editor, I tried to contact him by phone, but he didn't answer. And then I left a lot of messages on his answer phone. And then he wrote to me. And I was amazed that he put this in writing. This is what he said. I tried unsuccessfully to contact you by phone with regards to the Cruz papers. As you can tell by the editorial, we all doubted the data. But to doubt is different from concluding that he fabricated the data. I thought he did, but hoped, as stated in the editorial, that publication would encourage repetition of the studies. Wow, it gets great. Isn't this great? Now the editor of the journal that published the papers thought that the papers had been fabricated and published them. That's great, isn't it? Very strange, isn't it? So so we got this guy, doesn't work for the university. His co-authors don't know anything about the results. The journal editor thought they were fabricated. Julio Cruz himself had committed suicide. So he was obviously a very sad, lost man, wasn't he? I contacted the co-authors. I said, look, you know, this Julio Cruz, I can't find any, I've done an investigation. It took me a long time, you know, best part of 3 months. I can't find any evidence that these studies ever took place. You haven't got any evidence that they ever took place. Will you retract the papers? Will you actually take them out of the medical literature because they're not true, you know? And they wouldn't. They refuse to. They remain available on PubMed, and there's no evidence that they ever took place. So if you go onto PubMed now, you'll find these papers. They're just there in the medical literature. The editor doesn't want to retract them. The authors don't want to retract them, so they're just there. It's very interesting. And they will be used on patients, and this treatment will be used on patients around the world. So I thought it was bad. So that was my first experience of research misconduct. It's a little bit like yours over there, isn't it? You know, you start reviewing the evidence and you take it all on trust, and then you get more suspicious, don't you? You think, my goodness, you know, this doesn't make sense when you start looking at it in more detail. Then I had another experience. I was very interested in fluid resuscitation. So this is a trauma patient he's got an infusion going there. And there's two different kinds of fluids. You can have crystalloid solutions, which are like salty water, or you get these colloid solutions like, you know, Hemax cell and, you know, gelatin, and people have always wondered which one of these treatments is the best, and they've done randomized controlled trials comparing them. So I was involved in a systematic review of these. And there weren't very many trials. They didn't have very many patients in. But these trials here, all done by the same author, suggested that the starch solutions, the starch colloids, were actually better. And starch colloids were quite commonly used. And then this is what happened. In December 2009, this guy, Bolt, who's the author of these papers, he published a study comparing these two different drugs. The editor receives emails questioning the integrity of the research. One of the reviewers said that his results must have been magic. In November, the hospital where Bolt works makes an investigation and finds no data from any of these studies. They can't find any evidence that they were ever conducted. The ethics committee, all of his papers do mention an ethics committee, but the ethics committee doesn't exist. He made up the ethics committee. The ethics committee of some place in Germany, it just doesn't exist. So 90 papers were retracted from the literature because they were all fabricated. So all of these 90 papers were taken back. Because the British guidelines on fluid resuscitation of injured patients included many of these 90 patients, they had to withdraw the guidelines because these guidelines referred to these clinical trials. So all of these, the guidelines were withdrawn, and then there was a meta-analysis conducted that excluded the papers that were fabricated, and it got quite a different result. And actually the result was that not colloids are beneficial, but colloids are harmful. So the publication of these fabricated trials was, probably damaged patients. It's a very serious thing. So when you look at, the relative risk for death, when you take out the Bolt trials, there was a non-significant increase in the risk of, a significant increase in the risk of death, and a significant increase in the risk of renal failure. So we've been trying to get this treatment is still marketed, still widely used. It's less commonly used in Britain now because we all know about this Bolt case, but when pharmaceutical companies have an experience like this, they actually redirect their marketing strategies to places like Africa and China, where people might not have heard this story. And they can, and they're still marketed. There's no evidence that they're effective. So the Cochrane collaboration that I was very excited about, I became much more skeptical about it. I describe it like, it's a little bit like, when it's like falling in love. I'm sure people in this room have fallen in love. But when you fall in love, you just think everything about this person is just perfect. Don't you? There's everything. They like the same food as me and the same music. Oh my God, they're so right for me. Yeah? But then after about 6 months, oh my God, he's late again. He's such a pain in the neck. You kind of, all that beautiful rosy picture starts to get less rosy. That's what happened with me in the Cochrane collaboration. I thought when it started, wow, this is fantastic. This is it. You get all the evidence, you gather it all together, and you find out what works and what doesn't work, and that's great. And then I thought, but now when I fell out of love with it, I realized, well, it just takes everything on trust, you know. That's not really reviewing the evidence. You know, you take a piece of paper and you just think, well, everything on this paper is true. I'm going to take this, everything on this paper is true, and I'm going to make recommendations for patient care, you know. I mean, it's quite trusting, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? It's an extraordinary level of trust that anybody can write a paper, they can send it to a medical journal. The medical journal will not check anything about the data. They only check what's written on the paper to see if what's on the paper makes sense to itself, yeah? It doesn't have to relate to anything, right? They don't check if there was an ethics committee approval. They don't check if there was any patients actually recruited. They don't ask to see the data set. They just say, okay, you've given this paper. Everything you've written on this paper is true. Now we'll go and, you know, they take it all on trust. I personally don't think that's acceptable anymore. It has no policy in fraud. And so really it ignored fraud. Lately, in the last month or two, after a lot of, some colleagues and I have been trying to persuade the Cochrane collaboration to make a policy on fraud. They're developing a policy on fraud. And then I had another experience. I do a lot of work on hemorrhage, postpartum hemorrhage in particular. And I had, some time ago, I'm not sure when this was, 2008, I made a systematic review of randomized controlled trials of treatment for drugs, of this drug, tranexamic acid, tranexamsan, I think you call it here, for the prevention of postpartum hemorrhage. And we concluded that, I think so, tranexamic acid reduces blood loss in postpartum hemorrhage. Then I got, now having fallen out of love with systematic reviews, I'm much more skeptical. And we looked at these trials again. And then we did this with a colleague of mine called Catherine Kerr. And Catherine Kerr looks very good at finding details, noticing important details. And she noticed that in the first study by Guy, a Chinese author, I think, in 2000, there was a sort of typo. You can get prospective randomized controlled clinical trials, but you can't get prospective randomized case-controlled clinical trial. There isn't such a thing as a case-controlled clinical trial. It's an error, yeah? There are randomized trials and case-controlled studies, but they're different. You can't get randomized case-controlled trials, yeah? So there was a typo in this paper. But the thing that Catherine noticed is that the typo was also found in all of these other papers. Right? Wow, it's interesting. They all made the same mistake. A bit suspicious. So what we did is we got all of these papers and we put them on the floor of the office. And we looked at them. And they all had the same text. They were from different authors in different countries at different times, but most of the words in the paper were exactly the same. Yeah? And so delivery by cesarean section can cause delivery by all the same. And then we looked at the results. I mean, sometimes I've had students from, say, I don't know, India or whatever, and they say to me sometimes, oh, come on, they say, you know, as regards to plagiarism, they say, oh, come on, Ian, you know, it's really difficult. If English isn't your first language, well, India is not a good example, but say you come from a country where English isn't your first language, and they'll say, look, you know, it's all right for you, who English is your first language, you know, to make up very nice sentences that sound beautiful. But for us, it's much more difficult. So if we find a nice, beautiful sentence, we use it, you know. I mean, there's some, you know, you can have a little bit of sympathy for that. Maybe if you acknowledged that it was taken from there, you know. But, I mean, this was almost going a little bit further. It was a very nice paper, so we took it all. But more suspicious is the fact that they seem to have taken the results as well, because these are the ones that we didn't suspect plagiarism. This is Kyoto, and this is the Kyoto papers, the plagiarism suspected, and they said very similar results, yeah? Almost 0.79, 0.79, 0.79, you know, almost identical results. Something going wrong. So we don't trust those. In fact, yeah, we don't trust them at all. Now, the Cochrane collaboration uses all of these systems for weighting the level of evidence, and they use a system called grade that some of you might have come across, but it's all based on what's written in the manuscript being true. And often it's not true. They trust everyone. And I've sort of changed my feeling about systematic reviews. It used to be, it used to be gather all the evidence, wherever it is in the world, gather it all together, and then add it all up, and you find the truth. And now I feel it's more like this. It's actually, you're wading through a lot of rubbish. And a lot of it's not true. It's just rubbish. And that most of it should be thrown away. It wasn't conducted to improve the care of patients. It was conducted to improve the career of the researcher. The researcher had lost their way. And this, research wasn't done for the right reason. And a lot of research, I think, should be thrown away, and we should be looking for, the diamonds, really. The evidence that really improves patient outcome. I think a lot of the studies that I've included in meta-analyses in the past, I wouldn't trust it. It should be thrown away. And actually, you get almost closer to the truth by throwing it away. Because you either are left with studies that are valid, or you're left with the conclusion that we just don't know, and that's a better answer. Saying, I've no idea whether mannitol is effective as a treatment for head injury is closer to the truth than believing it improves outcome when it doesn't. So, how common is falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism? I see when you're looking to see what's coming next all the time. So, if you had to estimate how common do you think fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism is in my university, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine? How common is it? Give me a percentage. What would you say? Anybody?
More than you think.
More than you think. Would you like to put a number on that?
So difficult.
So difficult? Anybody want to make a guess?
1%.
1%? Yeah? 5%? Anybody else?
10%.
10%. Wow, it's like an auction. Any advance on 10%? We got 10% here. We got 20% at the back. Sold to the man at the back. No, we got 1, 5, 10. Fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. Well, the true answer is we don't really know. We don't know how common. I asked we've got a very small research integrity office at the London School of Hygiene. I asked them what the prevalence of research misconduct is, and they couldn't tell me because they say we haven't found any. But there have been surveys, and there have been lots of surveys, and I think this study is by Danielle Fanelli is a systematic review of studies of the prevalence of plagiarism, of the prevalence of misconduct. And what they do is they investigate it in two ways. They say, it's like a confidential study. And they say they assure the respondent that the results will be confidential. And then they ask them some questions. Have you ever engaged in research misconduct? Hands up who's engaged in research misconduct here. See, it's a hard thing to own up to, isn't it? It's nobody really wants to, but in some surveys, if it's done very well, I remember I was interviewed on in relation to the AIDS epidemic and things like this. I was randomly digitally dialed when I was living in New Zealand. I was random digit dialing for a telephone survey of sexual behavior. And I had all my family all around me, and I was on the phone, and they were asking me, all these questions about my sexual practices, and I was a bit surprised, but they were very clever because I didn't have to say anything. They just said, which one of these best describes, you mainly have sex with women, you mainly have sex with men, you have sex with both, you have sex with, also, and you just have to say 1, 2, 3, you just have to give a number. So it's very good. I was very impressed with this. But they used a similar kind of approach, in this sort of study where you don't have to get anybody to say something, you just have to get them to, and you assure them it's all going to be confidential. So there are two main questions. Have you committed research misconduct? Or are you aware of anybody else that's committed research misconduct? So the evidence from this meta-analysis is that when they ask researchers, have you committed research misconduct, about 2% admit to have conducted fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism. Now, about 2%. Now, do you think 2% is an overestimate or an underestimate? It's an underestimate, isn't it? So I'm like you, Sayaka. I think, well, 2%, come on, it's more likely to be 4%, maybe 5%. So I imagine that the prevalence of research misconduct is about 5%. And so even though my research integrity office can't tell me, I believe that 5% of the research in my university is fabricated, falsified, or plagiarized. Because why should it be any different? Why should it be any different just because it's my university? This is a systematic review of studies conducted at universities. If anything, it's a little bit higher because some of the studies on research integrity find out that research misconduct is slightly higher in epidemiology. Epidemiological research is slightly more prone to research misconduct. Perhaps it's because it's so easy. So it's probably about 5%. And in this survey, when they asked, do you know anybody else that's done research misconduct, the figure's about 14%. Do you know anybody? Anyway, we don't need to ask you that question. But the prevalence is much higher, about 14%. Isn't that interesting? So what's the prevalence of research misconduct at the London School of Hygiene? 5%. What's the prevalence of research misconduct in Kyoto University? Maybe it's a special place. Maybe it's 5%. Who knows? And questionable research practices that we're going to talk about tomorrow, well, those are really common. Everybody does those. So when they ask, have you committed them, I think about, I don't know, about 10% of people have done these questionable research practices, and I don't know, 40% of people know. Who doesn't know somebody who's selectively reported results on the basis of the p-value? So, yes, so research misconduct, these are the estimates, self, other, prevalence greater in medical and pharmaceutical research, epidemiology. So in my university, we have, London School of Hygiene has got all of these other universities around it. All of them have had research misconduct scandals. So I don't know if you remember the famous one about autism and MMR. That was, you know, in the University College London. And then there's, you know, all the universities around ours have. But in my university, there have been no allegations of research misconduct. They don't look for it, they don't find it. Do you think they would want to find it? They don't want to find it, do they? That's why they don't look for it. And that's why it's the, you know, research misconduct is like talking about sex or death for a university, right? It's the thing that you can't talk about. So we don't talk about it, we don't teach it. It's a quiet little secret that we've got. Yeah? That's not right, I don't think. So I think FFP, these serious forms of misconduct, not particularly rare, and we're going to come on to the other ones, these other questions later on. And it's really important, you see, because my experience of making these systematic reviews and publish them in the Cochrane Library, where I thought they would, you know, be the best evidence to inform patient management, you know, I concluded that mannitol was effective and that colloids were safe. And both of those are wrong. You know, mannitol, there's no evidence that it's effective, and colloids seem to do more harm than good, so it puts patients at risk. It wastes resources, big time. Think of all of the 90 papers retracted. Think of all of the editors and all of the reviewers and all of the, I don't know, all of the wasted time and effort that goes into it. It undermines trust in science. You know, when these big scandals come out, you know, what does the public think about us, you know? It doesn't do us any good. It damages institutions' reputations and career. It damages institutions' and careers. Cruz committed suicide, you know. He was a sick man, I believe. That misconduct should have been found sooner, and he needed help. Yeah? You know, you sometimes in life people lose their way, you know. Maybe, I don't know, you get a mental depression, anxiety, drugs, alcohol, whatever it is. You get lost. Well, if you're getting lost, you want someone to find you and then put you back on track before you get to jisatsu, you know. He needed help, and so not looking for research misconduct doesn't help anybody. Doesn't help the public, doesn't help the patients, doesn't help researchers, doesn't help universities. Thank you very much.